There was something in the 1905 records of the Smoky Foothills that always bothered researchers. A brief but precise gap between the last letter sent by a group of travelers and the official report of the disappearance of 48 men who never returned. Before we enter the archives, the narrator leaves the viewer with just one sentence, as if leafing through an old document before continuing. Write in the comments what city you are watching from, and what time it is there now. After that, historical silence once again fills the space. The story that survived is reconstructed from fragments, county records, domestic notes, 3 contradictory testimonies, and a collection of receipts stored in envelopes darkened by time. At the center of it all are 2 discrete figures, Eleanor and Martha Pinewood, sisters born into a family that had arrived in the humid valleys of the Appalachians in the 1850s. Daughters of farmers, they maintained the small wooden house built by their grandfather and lived simply, making do with what little the land offered: roots, medicinal plants, and odd jobs for travelers crossing the narrow stretch of the trade route that cut across the hillside. Records show that at that time, Smoky Foothills was nothing more than a succession of villages scattered among misty curves and low woods. Life there followed a slow rhythm: careful harvests, long nights, timid markets on Saturdays. It was a practical community, focused on survival, on the ability to keep the fire burning during wet winters, and on the exchange of favors between families who depended on each other. The modesty of the place contrasted with the climatic instability: storms that arrived without warning, winds that descended from the peaks as if pushing life down, compressing it into the valleys. The Pinewoods lived at the edge of the trail, in a house that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The aspect most commented on by neighbors in letters that have survived was the so-called root loft, a small room at the top of the house where the family kept dried roots, ancient herbs hanging, and utensils that the grandfather had brought from his home state decades earlier. There was nothing extraordinary there, at least not officially. But the 1899 household inventory records that Eleanor spent hours in that attic cataloging roots for medicinal use, while Martha kept records of who bought and who asked for credit. Modest but detailed documents. The 2 sisters' relationship with the community was respectful, albeit distant. They were known for their discretion, their habit of speaking softly, and their avoidance of conflict. The few existing photos show 2 women with upright posture, simple clothes, and calloused hands. Eleanor, the older of the 2, with a firm expression. Martha, more introspective, always with a notebook in her hands. They were ordinary figures, and perhaps for that reason, so neglected in subsequent investigations. The mystery begins to take shape when we analyze the last confirmed document before the disappearance of the 48 men, a receipt for the sale of dried roots, dated October 3, 1905, signed by Martha. The faded paper mentions a group of travelers who had stopped at the Pinewood house to buy supplies before continuing their ascent along the North Trail. The description is brief, almost bureaucratic. What intrigues scholars is the note written in pencil at the bottom, a short line that seems to have been scribbled in haste. Return before dusk. Ask about the noise. There is no explanation in the file as to what the noise was. None of the other notes contain a similar reference. But testimonies collected years later indicate that, during that week, residents further away from the route said they heard unusual sounds coming from the hillside, something between wood being dragged and heavy footsteps on damp leaves. At the end of the block, the documents close the circle of silence. The travelers left the Pinewood house, walking toward the narrowest stretch of the trail. And from that point on, the story fractures. None of them were ever seen again. The file ends there. And that is exactly where the real mystery begins. The months leading up to the 1905 disappearance appear in the documents as a period of routine and predictability. The county was undergoing the transition between the end of the summer harvests and the arrival of the first heavy rains. The trails were slippery, and travelers were generally advised to leave before mid-afternoon. Still, that stretch of the Smoky Foothills continued to welcome merchants, messengers, and small groups crossing the mountain carrying goods, letters, and news from larger cities. It was at this slow and disciplined pace that Eleanor and Martha organized their days throughout that year. Neighbors, especially the O'Hearn and Mallory families, described the two sisters as punctual, quiet, and meticulous with their records. Their home, though simple, attracted people for a practical reason. The root cellar contained vegetables that were not easily found in the small village stores. The Pinewood family dried ginseng, burdock, angelica, and other plants used for both home remedies and seasonings and preserves. This meant that even in isolation, the sisters had a steady stream of visitors. Eleanor had a habit of waking up before sunrise. She would climb up to the attic to check on the hanging roots, turn the drying trays, and note the days of waiting. When she came downstairs, she would prepare weak coffee while Martha spread her notebooks on the main table, reviewing payments, debts, and pending orders. The two rarely went out together. One stayed at home while the other walked to the village to exchange mail or deliver small packages. The sisters' daily routine only drew attention for one reason mentioned in two testimonies. Eleanor had begun to avoid the North Trail at the end of summer. She mentioned that the wind sounded strange in that direction, but described it only as a feeling, never as a threat. Martha, on the other hand, seemed bothered by another detail. According to a neighbor, she had commented that someone had started watching the house at dusk. Nothing else was found in the records, and no name was associated with the report. These subtle clues were not considered relevant at the time, but today, taken together, they seem to form a sequence of discrete tensions. Martha's notes show few changes, but between August and September 1905 there are erased pages, interruptions, and curious gaps. Some dates have been crossed out. Other notes appear truncated, as if she had started writing and, for some reason, stopped in the middle of a sentence. Experts suggest that this may have been the result of fatigue or haste, something common in rural life. But there is also the possibility that some event, still unknown, caused the change in the rhythm of the records. Still, none of these details seem to bother the community. On market Saturdays, the Pinewoods were seen in the central square, carrying small baskets of dried roots. They spoke little, but always fulfilled their deliveries. Nothing indicated serious tension. On the contrary, letters sent by distant merchants mention the sisters' efficiency and precision, especially in counting and preparing ingredients. The first indirect reference to the 48 men appears in a county record. They were a diverse group, consisting of independent travelers, displaced workers, and two small merchants who crossed the trails to buy tools on the other side of the mountain. They were first seen in the region in mid-September of that same year, passing through smaller villages, buying food, and asking about shorter routes. There is no evidence of conflict or suspicious behavior. It seems to have been just another group of men trying to cross the mountain before the fall rains. When they arrived at the Pinewood house, according to the receipt signed by Martha, they were tired but calm. The sisters provided roots, water, and consigned a small package of medicinal herbs to one of the merchants. Nothing in the document suggests tension, but three details stand out in the testimonies collected decades later. One of the travelers reportedly asked Eleanor about noises on the north slope. Martha noted in her notebook that they seemed hurried. A neighbor recalled that Martha was not in her usual mood that afternoon. The last sign of normality appears in an account by a young man named Frederick Mallory, then 14 years old. He mentions seeing Martha placing a damp cloth on the windowsill, as if trying to muffle the dust or smell from the attic. He also mentions, and this is considered significant by historians, that Eleanor did not respond when he waved, which was unusual for her, as she was usually cordial. All of this seems minor, almost irrelevant, but in the chronology of events, these micro-gestures make up the last coherent portrait of the sisters before the event that would shake the entire region. And then we come to the final detail in this block, which closes the records before the disappearance. On October 3rd, shortly after the group of travelers set off on the Northern Trail, Martha wrote a note that researchers found only many years later, tucked between 2 pages of the account book. If they don't return by dusk, ask Eleanor about the noise. This phrase, aligned with the receipt note, creates the first documentary contradiction in the case, because according to all subsequent records, no one ever came back to ask anything. The reconstruction of the disappearance of the 48 men always begins on the same afternoon, October 3rd, 1905, when the group left the Pinewood sisters' house carrying bags of dried roots, filled canteens, and the intention to cross the North Trail before the sky closed in. County weather records show that the weather was unstable that day. Low clouds, high humidity, and winds from the east, which tended to blow erratically around the mountain curves. Nothing unusual for early fall, but enough to slow the journey. The last confirmed sighting of the group was approximately 1 kilometer above the Pinewood house, near a narrow bend where the vegetation closed in around the trail. The testimony containing this information was given almost 40 years later by Frederick Mallory, now an adult, who recalled seeing figures walking while gathering firewood with his father. He remembered only voices mixed with the wind and the rhythmic sound of heavy footsteps on the damp ground. From then on, the historical trail breaks. Documents indicate that that same afternoon, a sudden change in the wind began to sweep across the hillside. The windows of the nearest houses slammed shut, and a smell of wet earth spread quickly, something that is mentioned in 2 testimonies collected decades later. Eleanor, according to a neighbor, was especially sensitive to climate change, and was seen going up to the attic shortly after the change in the wind. Martha remained in the kitchen, reviewing her notebooks with visible unease. The weather worsened around 4 in the afternoon when a thick fog began to descend on the foothills. Visibility dropped dramatically. The residents of isolated houses closed their doors and gathered their animals, as this particular fog, dense, creamy, clinging, usually lingered for hours. It was precisely during this period that the group of 48 men would have reached the narrowest part of the Northern Trail. One of the most disturbing features of this case is the absence of any material trace of the group in this region, not for lack of searching, but because, according to later reports, no drag marks, falls, or signs of struggle were found. Nothing out of the ordinary on the ground, no lost objects, no preserved footprints. The trail seemed to have continued to exist, as it always had, indifferent to what had passed through it. But a piece of the puzzle found years later indicates that something deeply disturbed the sisters that afternoon. According to the reports gathered, Eleanor came down from the attic shortly before nightfall with a pale face and a stiff expression, as if she had heard something coming from the hillside. She called for Martha, who immediately dropped her notebooks. A distant neighbor claimed to have seen the two leaving the house and walking a few meters toward the trailhead, staring intently at the fog that covered the climb. This information does not appear in the official documents of the time, but it appears consistently in 3 separate statements. The 2 sisters stood at the edge of the trail for a few minutes, motionless without exchanging a word, until Martha said something that no one heard completely. Only the final sentence reached the researchers. It wasn't like this before. The meaning of this remains unclear. What is known is that minutes later, with the fog even thicker and the wind changing direction, the sisters went back inside. The door was slammed shut with unusual force, according to Frederick Mallory himself, who had been passing by and heard the bang. He also reported a detail that went unnoticed for decades. The moment the door slammed, he heard a second sound coming from the hillside, something like wood being pressed or bent slowly. This testimony, although belated, is consistent with a note that researchers found in the attic. A loose sheet of paper written by Eleanor, apparently never finished. On it, there are only 3 legible lines. The wind has changed again. The leaves shouldn't move like this. There's something stuck. The excerpt does not specify what, and there is no date. But the type of paper, handwriting, and ink suggest that it was written very close to the time of the disappearance, possibly that same week. As the fog became almost impenetrable, the group of travelers continued to climb. According to the researchers' calculations, they would have reached the area known as Passagem do Cedro Baixo, Low Cedar Pass, around 5:10 p.m. This estimate is based on the usual pace of travel and the distance recorded on old maps. There, the trail branched into 2 narrow curves. One led to the top, the other skirted the hillside toward a young forest. Whichever path they chose, nothing survived to prove it. The search report made the following week describes a puzzling scenario. The forest was intact, the trail showed no signs of interruption, and no broken branches or uneven ground indicated the sudden movement of such a large group. The search dogs, used only 2 days after the disappearance, found no trace. The rain had started, but not enough to erase everything. It is at this point that the events inside the Pinewood house take on importance. According to a neighbor's testimony, around 6:30 p.m., a light remained on in the attic, which was unusual for the sisters. They saved lamp oil and rarely worked at the top of the house at night. The witness claimed to have seen shadows moving through the attic window, slow movements as if someone were looking for something among the trays and boxes. Scholars believe that the sisters were trying to confirm the source of a sound coming from the hillside, perhaps wood being pressed. Perhaps long, spaced-out footsteps, distant but distinct in the silent landscape of that late afternoon. It is impossible to know. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the wind grew stronger, and then comes the last indirect record of that night, one of the strangest found to date. Frederick, already an adult when he gave his testimony, stated that he saw the door of the Pinewood house open for a moment, as if someone were about to leave, but then slam shut. He did not see who opened the door. He only heard something like an object falling to the floor. Researchers found a lamp with cracked glass in the 1905 inventory, listed as damaged that same week. There is no proof that it was knocked over that night. But this item, added to the young man's account, fits in with a possible sudden movement inside the house, perhaps caused by fear, hesitation, or urgency. From then on, nothing else was seen, heard, or recorded. The night progressed. The fog slowly dissipated around midnight, and silence took over the entire region. It was only the next morning that the first questions began to arise. The travelers did not show up in the village to the north, where they should have arrived the night before. The Pinewoods, in turn, were not seen outside their home at dawn, which was unusual. And then, in the county record, a line appears that forever marked this case. In the early hours of the day, it was found that there were no signs of the group. Searches begin. The Pinewood sisters claim to have heard nothing relevant. But this statement contradicts everything the witnesses reported. It contradicts the light in the attic. It contradicts the sounds they said came from the hillside. It contradicts Martha's whispered phrase, "It wasn't like this before." And it contradicts Eleanor's fixed gaze at the trail, as if she were waiting for something, or someone, to return. The block ends exactly where the formal investigations begin, and in the official reports, the next clue is even more puzzling. A trace found on the north slope, so small, so out of place, that researchers spent decades trying to understand how it could have remained there, alone. The first searches began in an improvised manner at dawn on October 4th. It was a common procedure in the region. When a group took longer than expected, families from neighboring villages mobilized even before the authorities. Men with experience in hiking gathered, formed teams, and headed for the north slope, where they believed the 48 travelers might have taken a detour or encountered some obstacle. What no one expected, and what remains recorded in dozens of subsequent testimonies, was to find the trail in a completely normal state. The ground was damp, but undisturbed. The low branches were intact. The rocks were arranged as they always had been. The first groups believed that the travelers might have taken another route without warning, which would not have been unusual. But throughout that morning, as more trails were checked, it became clear that there was no trace of so many men having passed through. Sniffer dogs, brought in from a village almost 10 kilometers away, were brought in to assist in the search at the end of the morning. They walked along the main trail, skirted rocks, and traversed areas of dense forest. At no point did they show any definite signs. They only hesitated for a few seconds on a narrow stretch, about 300 meters from the Passagem do Cedro Baixo fork, and then moved on without reacting. On that very stretch, the searchers found the trace that would spark decades of discussion. A single strip of fabric stuck under an exposed root. It was small, worn, partially torn. Subsequent investigation concluded that it could be part of a coat lining or a backpack strap. The problem, document after document reinforces this, is that this fragment appeared to have been deposited there even before the previous day's rain. In other words, if it belonged to one of the travelers, it had been stuck to that route since before the disappearance, an inconsistency that has never been resolved. Meanwhile, the residents' attention began to turn to the Pinewood sisters, not because they were suspects, but because they were, until that moment, the last people known to have been in contact with the entire group. County authorities recorded their first official visit to the house on the afternoon of the 4th. The report describes the sisters as cooperative but tense, and mentions that Eleanor seemed uncomfortable with direct questions, while Martha avoided raising her eyes. One observation in this document is considered crucial by modern researchers. The sisters insist they heard nothing. They claim to have gone to bed early. This statement contrasts sharply with the unofficial statements of neighbors who saw the light on in the attic and shadows moving inside the house for much of the previous night. Frederick Mallory himself, when interviewed decades later, reaffirmed that the door of the Pinewood house opened and closed forcefully shortly before nightfall, a fact omitted from the early records. Over the following days, rumors began to spread rapidly. Some residents claimed to have heard distant sounds during the night of the disappearance, something like wood being bent or pushed, always associated with the hillside. Others said they noticed a strong smell of wet earth, as if the mountain had been disturbed. There were also comments about the unusual behavior of the Pinewood sisters. Martha was reportedly seen burning papers in the backyard 2 days after the first searches, while Eleanor avoided any conversation that mentioned the travelers. The official investigation, however, never found evidence linking the sisters to the disappearance. Nothing was missing from the house. There was no indication of violence or active involvement. All the documents left in the attic, notebooks, receipts, route catalogues, were examined and catalogued. The only anomaly, repeated throughout the process, was the presence of interrupted notes, erased dates, and loose phrases that seemed to point to some concern that had been growing for weeks. This is where the most discussed revelation of the case emerges. Not a concrete discovery, but a human pattern that, when analyzed with historical distance, offers the most plausible explanation. Chronologists who have studied the behavior of the two sisters in depth identify a recurring theme in the records. Eleanor and Martha were afraid of something on the north slope, not of a specific presence, not of an identified threat, but of what the wind carried every time it blew in that direction. This unease appears in both of their notes. It appears in the statements of their neighbors. It appears in the way they hesitated to walk that trail at dusk. And it appears especially clearly in the last sentence written by Martha before the travelers' departure. If they don't return by dusk, ask Eleanor about the noise. Current researchers interpret this sentence not as a warning about the travelers, but as a concern about the recurring noise they themselves had been hearing in the previous weeks. It may have been the sound of unstable trees, shifting rocks, branches being pressed by moisture. Common phenomena in mountainous regions, especially at that time of year. But for two women living alone, next to the most isolated trail in the county, these noises could easily take on greater proportions. The human revelation, silent, imperfect, plausible, is that the Pinewood sisters probably knew that something on the trail was not stable that week. Perhaps an area of soil loosened by rain, perhaps a tree about to give way, perhaps a minor landslide waiting for a trigger. Nothing supernatural, nothing extraordinary, just the natural force of the mountain, unpredictable and silent. And here comes the most disturbing element of the entire investigation. There was no record of a landslide the next morning, no marks of disturbed earth, no visible changes to the hillside. This led many to reject this explanation over the years, but the authorities at the time, after 3 weeks of searching, concluded in their final report that an unobserved natural event was the most likely hypothesis. The mountain could have given way subtly, swallowing the group without leaving obvious marks, or a large tree could have fallen and blocked a narrow path, forcing the men to detour, getting lost in the fog, dispersing, succumbing to the weather and disorientation. Nothing impossible, nothing unlikely for that region. The most painful point, however, lies in the role of the sisters. Eleanor and Martha, despite the contradictions, were not held responsible for the disappearance, but the documents make it clear that they carried a silent burden for the rest of their lives. Neighbors report that after the event, they almost never opened the attic at night. The light, once occasional, disappeared forever from the window. Both became even more reclusive, and Martha's notebook, which she continued to fill until her death, never again had a page crossed out or interrupted. It is as if whatever they feared on the trail had been swallowed up along with the travelers, and the silence, which had once been routine, became a kind of permanent mourning. The notebook ends at the point where the search is officially called off, leaving only one observation in the final report: no conclusive answers. The trail remains unchanged. The community remains vigilant. What no one recorded, but what 3 neighbors confirmed decades later, is that on the last night of the search, a light came back on in the Pinewood attic for just a few minutes, and then it went out, never to return. More than 8 decades have passed since the disappearance of the 48 men in the foothills of Smoky Foothills, and even today the county archives keep that set of documents with a strange solemnity. They are not on display. They are not exhibited in showcases. They are kept in thick paper boxes, labeled with old handwriting, as if the guardians of that collection understood that each sheet carries more silence than history, and that silence must be handled with care. Rereading everything today, with the distance of someone who did not live through that time, but has studied its fragments for years, it is impossible not to realize that the weight of the case was never just in the disappearance of the travelers. It lies, above all, in what was left behind, in what remained between the lines, in the cut words, in the restrained gestures, in the brief notes that the sisters wrote without ever imagining that they would be examined by so many curious hands over the following years. The historian who pores over these archives quickly senses that Eleanor and Martha Pinewood are not just secondary characters in this enigma, but rather the silent key to the whole atmosphere that preceded the disappearance. Not because they did anything, but because they were the only living witnesses to a change that no one else noticed. They lived next to the trail. They knew the wind, the sounds, the rhythm of the mountain. They knew how to distinguish the normal from the abnormal, in a way that those who passed by sporadically could never understand. And it is precisely this sensitivity that transcends time more powerfully than any report. Scholars argue that the most profound revelation of this case is not in finding a definitive answer, but in accepting the limited scope of human perceptions in such isolated environments. The mountain was alive, but not in the metaphorical sense that some would try to romanticize decades later. It was alive because it was unstable, because its structures changed from year to year, shaped by rains, roots, subtle erosion, and variations in vegetation density. And that instability, however small, was enough to alter the fate of those who depended on it to cross from one village to another. When trying to reconstruct what may have happened, one always faces the same dilemma. What is lost when a trail disappears? What is lost when the last human gaze on a landscape cannot be recorded? And what is lost when the only material trace, a strip of fabric stuck under a root, seems older than it should be? These questions are not just technical details for the researcher. They become a kind of mirror, reflecting the fragility of human narratives. History depends on what remains, and in this case almost nothing remained. When analyzing Martha's notebooks, one notices that her handwriting changes after the disappearance. The letters become more restrained, straighter, narrower. It is as if a whole world had closed in on her. From that point on, she records payments, quantities, dates, but no longer records hesitations, doubts, noises, or even her own routine. Eleanor, for her part, left almost no traces other than brief, loose notes found years later in the attic. Both survived many years after the event. They lived in the same house, they tended the same roots, they maintained the same daily routine of survival. But according to the few neighbors who lived long enough to be interviewed, they never spoke about that week again. They never mentioned the travelers. They never publicly questioned what might have happened. The absence became part of the landscape, just like the wind that continued to blow across the north slope. When visiting the region today, and this historian has done so more than once, one realizes that the trail has changed. The forest has grown. The stones have rearranged themselves. Erosion has continued its work. The stretch where the strip of fabric was found no longer exists as it did at the time. And yet, there is something almost ritualistic about the experience of walking to the point where the stories converge. Not in a mystical sense, but in a documentary sense. It is like walking inside a memory that belongs to other people, and at the same time like walking inside an unanswered question. Over time, the community stopped treating the disappearance as an isolated tragedy and began to see it as part of the emotional topography of the region itself. There are no monuments, no plaques, no tributes. People just know. They know that 48 men crossed that trail in 1905 and were never seen again. They know that 2 women remained on the edge of the landscape, carrying knowledge that they may never have been able to put into words. They know that the truth, if it ever existed at all, has been diluted by fog, rain, and the passage of time. The researcher, upon concluding this study, recalls a detail that is perhaps the most symbolic of the entire investigation. In the final county records dating from the 1940s, there is a single note about the Pinewood sisters after Martha's death. It is brief, almost indifferent. Property remains occupied by Eleanor. Light in the attic never turned on again. It is not relevant data for any practical conclusion, but it carries a silent weight, as if it summed up everything that will never be fully understood. In the end, perhaps the case of the 48 missing men is not remembered for the magnitude of what happened, but for the way the absence spread, discreet, slow, resistant, between the lines of all the documents that survived. An absence that does not scream, it just settles in. And, like the wind that blows along the northern trail at dusk, it remains there, even when no one else knows how to name it. The last sentence of this account, which this researcher writes after decades of studying what can no longer be seen, is also the most sincere. Some voids do not ask for answers, only silence.